Over the past decade, a potent synthetic opioid called fentanyl has fueled an unprecedented drug crisis. In 2023 alone, over 100,000 drug-related deaths were recorded in the United States, and approximately 70% of those were caused by fentanyl or other synthetic opioids. This toll far exceeds the annual fatalities from car accidents or gun violence in the U.S. Fentanyl, originally a medical painkiller, is 50 times stronger than heroin, with as little as 2 milligrams, a few grains, constituting a lethal dose. Its unmatched potency means a tiny quantity can cause mass casualties, a grim reality behind the overdose statistics. What began as a wave of prescription opioid abuse in the early 2000s has mutated into a fentanyl-driven catastrophe, catching public health systems off guard. The crisis isn't confined to the US. Canada has seen similar surges, and authorities in Europe and Asia watch warily for fentanyl's spread. But nowhere has the devastation been as severe as in American communities, where fentanyl-laced pills and powders infiltrate urban and rural areas alike. Each pill or packet carries the risk of death. The margin between a high and a fatal dose is razor thin. This documentary investigates how fentanyl is made and trafficked globally, and the complex role one nation, China, plays at the center of this story. We will explore China's domestic fight against drugs and the simultaneous accusations that Chinese supply chains feed the world's fentanyl trade. It's a story of a drug so lethal it's measured in micrograms, entwined with international crime networks and geopolitical sparring between superpowers. Fentanyl is synthetic, crafted by chemists not grown in fields. Its production starts with precursor chemicals, the molecular building blocks. Unlike heroin, which requires opium poppies and sprawling plantations, fentanyl can be brewed in small labs hidden in basements or warehouses. This synthetic nature means traffickers can manufacture it anywhere in the world with the right chemicals and expertise. Dual-use chemical factories, facilities making legitimate pharmaceuticals or industrial chemicals, can be subverted to churn out precursors and fentanyl itself, masking illicit output within legal trade. In practice, the global fentanyl supply chain coalesces around two main pipelines. The first pipeline emerged in the mid-2010s. Finished fentanyl and its analogs produced in China and sold directly to overseas customers, often via online black markets. By the late 2010s, U.S. officials had identified the People's Republic of China as the primary source of illicit fentanyl flooding American streets. Traffickers in China advertised potent fentanyl analogs online and shipped orders through international mail, exploiting express parcel services to reach buyers in North America and beyond. Packages of powder, often under a kilogram, were mailed from China with innocuous labels. Hard to detect, yet typically over 90% pure fentanyl. Each such parcel contained thousands of potentially lethal doses. The second pipeline has now become dominant precursor chemicals and know-how flowing from China to Mexico, where Mexican cartels synthesize fentanyl in bulk and smuggle it into the United States. As China's government tightened controls on fentanyl around 2019, direct shipments from China to the U.S. appeared largely to cease, according to U.S. drug enforcement reports. But the illicit trade adapted rather than disappeared. Chinese chemical suppliers shifted to exporting fentanyl precursors, the chemical ingredients, to Mexico. There, cartels like the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation Cartel operate clandestine superlabs, pressing fentanyl into fake prescription pills or mixing it into heroin and other drugs destined for the U.S. market. Many of the chemicals used to make synthetic fentanyl still come from China, enabling Mexican traffickers to mass-produce the drug and smuggle it across the southwestern U.S. The result is a globalized supply chain. Reagents manufactured in Asia, converted into deadly product in Mexico, and smuggled into the United States and Canada. Other hubs have begun to emerge. India, for instance, is now noted as a rising source of fentanyl powder and precursors, but China and Mexico remain at the core of the trade. U.S. border seizures of fentanyl have skyrocketed accordingly. In fiscal year 2024, U.S. Customs and Border Protection seized over 9.9 metric tons of illicit fentanyl, more than in all previous years of the agency's history combined. Traffickers hide the drug in truckloads of legitimate goods in car tires and engine compartments or strap it to human mules. The enormous profit margins. A few $1,000s of chemicals can produce millions of dollars in fentanyl pills, fuel the ingenuity and brazenness of these smuggling operations. At the same time, online trafficking remains a concern. Dark web marketplaces and encrypted messaging apps allow U.S. customers to order fentanyl or precursors directly from overseas suppliers. Chinese vendors, often operating via seemingly legitimate chemical companies, have been caught openly offering discreet shipping, sometimes even guaranteeing delivery past customs. This is a new breed of drug cartel, tech-savvy, decentralized, and transnational. A lethal dose can now arrive in the mail, indistinguishable from an ordinary parcel. Understanding fentanyl's journey from factory to street is only one side of the coin. To fully grasp the issue, we must examine how governments, especially China's, are responding. The Chinese government faces a contradiction. At home, it wages a fierce war on drugs. Yet abroad, Chinese chemicals and networks are entangled in the fentanyl trade. Our story now turns to China's domestic front in the opioid fight. In line with this stance, China has aggressively regulated fentanyl and related substances on its own soil. In May 2019, under international pressure, Beijing took the notable step of adding all fentanyl-related compounds to its list of controlled substances. This blanket scheduling was applauded by U.S. officials at the time, who believed it would close legal loopholes that chemists had exploited to churn out ever so slightly modified fentanyl analogs. China touts this measure as evidence of its goodwill and responsibility. It became one of the first countries to schedule fentanyl class-wide. Chinese authorities also placed stricter controls on key precursors. For example, in 2018, China scheduled the precursor chemicals NPP and ANPP in accordance with UN conventions, and it has since added more precursors to its controlled list as international guidelines evolved. Indeed, China has made high-profile examples of those who violate its drug laws. In one landmark case in 2019, following a tip from U.S. investigators, a Chinese court in Hebei province convicted a fentanyl trafficking ring that had been shipping large quantities to the United States. The ring's leader received a suspended death sentence and others were given life terms, extraordinarily severe punishments intended as a clear signal. Chinese police had coordinated with U.S. Homeland Security on that investigation, arresting over 20 suspects and seizing 11.9 kilograms of fentanyl, enough to potentially kill millions. This case was hailed as the first successful joint U.S.-China fentanyl bust, and it showcased China's law enforcement capabilities when it chooses to deploy them. In another case in 2021, a court in Shanghai similarly sentenced suppliers caught mailing fentanyl to the U.S. Though less publicized, it demonstrated continued if rare cooperation between Chinese and American agencies. On the home front, Chinese officials maintain that fentanyl abuse is not a significant domestic issue. The government reports relatively few cases of illicit fentanyl consumption inside China, given that pharmaceutical fentanyl is tightly controlled in hospitals. Chinese authorities continue to stress publicly that fentanyl use and distribution are not domestic concerns in China. In other words, from Beijing's perspective, China does not have a fentanyl demand problem. Its drug issues tend to involve methamphetamine heroin from the Golden Triangle or new synthetic stimulants. This stance shapes China's narrative. China portrays itself as a victim of foreign drug demand and a responsible enforcer at home rather than a source of the problem. Despite strict laws, complete enforcement is challenging. China is a chemical manufacturing giant, and illicit actors within China have exploited regulatory gaps and the sheer scale of the industry. Factories in Guangdong labs and Wuhan trading companies in Shanghai, the vast industrial ecosystem can hide rogue operations. Chinese regulators conduct inspections and periodically announce busts of illegal labs, yet the incentives to clandestinely produce precursors can outweigh the risks for some, given the lucrative overseas market. Beijing insists it is doing its part and improving each year, pointing to the 2019 blanket ban, and more recently, new rules introduced to monitor and police precursor chemicals. In September 2024, for example, China says it tightened controls on a slate of fentanyl precursors, increasing government oversight on 7 chemicals, including 3 key fentanyl ingredients. U.S. officials acknowledged this as a valuable step forward. However, the other side of China's role in the fentanyl saga lies beyond its borders. Even as China cracks down internally, evidence has mounted that Chinese suppliers are deeply enmeshed in global fentanyl trafficking networks. This paradox, a country fighting drugs at home while its citizens and companies are implicated abroad, is at the heart of international accusations against Beijing. The international community's scrutiny of China in the fentanyl crisis boils down to a troubling question. Is China inadvertently or even willfully fueling the very drug plague it decries? Over the years, a growing body of evidence, seizures, investigations, undercover stings, and financial trails has pointed to China as the key source of precursors, and often the source of fentanyl itself, in illicit channels. U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA officials, assess that the majority of fentanyl on U.S. streets and the chemicals to produce it originate in China, even if the final assembly happens in Mexican cartel labs. What does this evidence look like? Take business records and websites, for example. Until recently, one could find Chinese companies openly advertising fentanyl analogs and manufacturing equipment online. A stunning case uncovered by U.S. congressional investigators revealed that a state-owned prison in Hebei province, Shijiazhuang Prison, was operating a chemical company called Yafeng that for 8 years sold fentanyl ingredients to Americans. The company's English-language website brazenly offered illegal synthetic opioids and even boasted to U.S. clients that 100% of our shipments will clear customs. This was not an isolated actor, but a company tied into the Chinese state system, an alarming illustration of how deeply embedded the fentanyl commerce had become. Financial investigations further expose the web. Money trails from U.S. fentanyl deals often lead back to China. Chinese brokers have been found to launder billions of dollars for North American drug cartels. This is done through an underground banking system where wealthy Chinese individuals seeking to move money overseas swap clean funds for drug cash, effectively making cartel money vanish into legitimate accounts. Such networks, often orchestrated by transnational Chinese crime syndicates, mean that Chinese nationals aren't just supplying chemicals, they're also helping wash the profits of the fentanyl trade, taking their cut along the way. U.S. authorities have responded by indicting and sanctioning Chinese individuals and entities involved. The U.S. Department of Justice in recent years charged multiple Chinese nationals and even companies with conspiracy to traffic fentanyl or precursor chemicals. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned over 65 China-based persons, including those in Hong Kong, for involvement in fentanyl-related synthetic opioids like nitazines, and even for trafficking equipment like pill presses. Such sanctions freeze suspects out of the global banking system, at least wherever U.S. influence extends. In September 2023, President Biden went so far as to officially designate China as a major source country of illicit drugs, adding it to a watch list alongside traditional narcotics producers. A diplomatic slap that Beijing protested bitterly. Perhaps the most damning allegations come from high places in Washington. Some U.S. officials and lawmakers accuse elements of the Chinese state of turning a blind eye, or worse, to the export of fentanyl, as long as it harms other countries and not China itself. A bipartisan inquiry by the U.S. House of Representatives in 2022 suggested that Beijing incentivizes its vast chemical industry to export fentanyl precursors, even those banned domestically, through tax rebates and subsidies. In other words, Chinese companies can profit from producing certain chemicals overseas that they cannot sell at home. One former federal prosecutor, Matthew Cronin, who led that House inquiry, put it starkly, "So the Chinese government pays you to send drugs to America, but executes you for selling them in China." This striking quote encapsulates the alleged double standard. Chinese officials vehemently deny such claims. They maintain that any Chinese nationals involved are criminals acting without government approval, and that China as a state never encourages drug trafficking. It's true that since 2019, after China scheduled fentanyl, direct exports of finished fentanyl to the U.S. dropped sharply. But traffickers simply shifted tactics. U.S. drug enforcement reports note that Chinese suppliers quickly pivoted to exporting precursors and partnering with Mexican networks. The pipeline kept flowing, albeit in a new form. Critics argue that Chinese authorities could crack down harder on those precursor exporters, but may be choosing not to, perhaps due to competing priorities or reluctance to hurt chemical trade. Still, the hard evidence of Chinese links from undercover buys to shipping documents has convinced many international observers that without Chinese suppliers, the fentanyl scourge would be much more limited. Even China's class-wide ban did not eliminate the country's role, it only changed it. As of 2023, the U.S. government estimates that China remains the leading producer of fentanyl precursors that cartels need. In global trafficking terms, China is a crucial source node, providing raw materials, some finished product, and even money laundering services. This places China uncomfortably in the spotlight of U.S. authorities. In recent years, fentanyl has jumped from being a public health issue to a high-priority diplomatic flashpoint between Washington and Beijing. With American lives at stake and Chinese nationals implicated, U.S. leaders have been pressing China for action, while Chinese leaders bristle at the accusatory tone. The result has been a mix of friction and occasional collaboration. Initially, there were hopeful strides. After President Xi Jinping agreed in 2018 to consider the fentanyl clampdown, which led to the 2019 class-wide ban, U.S. officials praised China's responsiveness. For a short time, American and Chinese narcotics agents worked together. As seen in joint investigations like the 2019 case, there was even talk of a new era of counter-narcotics partnership. However, broader geopolitical tensions soon derailed this cooperation. In 2020, relations soured sharply over issues unrelated to drugs trade disputes, the COVID-19 pandemic blame game, human rights sanctions. Notably, the U.S. sanctioned a Chinese government forensic institute in Xinjiang for complicity in human rights abuses. In retaliation, Beijing reportedly froze collaboration with U.S. drug enforcement. By 2021 to 2022, joint operations had ground to a halt. The breaking point came in August 2022, when a high-profile visit to Taiwan by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi angered Beijing. China responded by suspending all counter-narcotics cooperation with the United States. Hotlines went silent. American agents could no longer get their Chinese counterparts on the phone, as one former U.S. official noted ruefully. What had been a workable, if limited partnership slipped into a freeze just as fentanyl overdoses in America hit record levels. A breakthrough of sorts came in late 2023. With U.S.-China relations under strain on many fronts, from trade to Taiwan, both governments saw an opportunity to make progress on a tangible issue. In November 2023, at a summit in San Francisco, President Biden and President Xi met face-to-face. Amid efforts to stabilize the relationship, they struck a modest deal on fentanyl. China agreed to re-engage on counter-narcotics, and the US in turn removed a controversial sanction on China's Forensic Institute. The two nations announced the formation of a joint working group on fentanyl, resuming discussions that had been dormant for 3 years. The Chinese Ministry of Public Security also reportedly began sharing real-time information again on suspicious chemical shipments, sending over 100 alerts about fentanyl-related export attempts in the month after the summit. This was a notable gesture. It signaled that Beijing was willing to cooperate at least to some extent, after a long silence. The working group met in early 2024 in Beijing. Officials from both sides sat down to hash out concrete steps: better coordination of law enforcement, targeting pill press and precursor shipments, and choking off financial flows. By February 2024, even the U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security and China's top police official were meeting in person in Vienna, on the sidelines of a UN forum, to further discuss fentanyl cooperation. China subsequently scheduled several new fentanyl precursor chemicals, and began publicly warning its chemical industry not to sell to illicit drug makers overseas, even explicitly naming the US and Mexico as destinations of concern. These moves suggest that Chinese authorities, at least for now, are taking the issue more seriously, perhaps due to the renewed diplomatic engagement. US officials noted early signs of progress, like fewer Chinese-sourced precursors being intercepted at US airports in early 2024. Still, deep mistrust remains. China's cooperation comes with conditions. Beijing insists the US must show respect and recently pressed Washington to remove China from the narcotic-source blacklist as an act of good faith. American lawmakers, for their part, continue to advance legislation to sanction Chinese fentanyl traffickers, and even to scrutinize whether any Chinese officials intentionally aid the trafficking. One clause in a 2024 U.S. defense law asks for an investigation into whether the Chinese government assisted in or approved the trafficking of fentanyl precursors to cartels. In other words, while diplomacy is now underway, the geopolitical chess match over fentanyl is far from resolved. The fentanyl crisis does not exist in a vacuum. It sits at the nexus of global narcotics control and great power politics. The tensions between the US and China over fentanyl are one facet of a larger geopolitical puzzle, one that includes Mexico's own struggles, the response of the international community, and the shifting strategies of organized crime networks worldwide. First, consider Mexico. Meanwhile, other nations and international bodies are increasingly involved. In mid-2023, the United States launched a global coalition to address synthetic drug threats, rallying over 160 countries and international organizations to coordinate against fentanyl and other synthetics. This coalition aims to improve cross-border information sharing, harmonize laws on precursors, and exchange best practices, essentially to ensure that if China tightens one tap, the flow doesn't just divert to India or Southeast Asia without notice. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime and the International Narcotics Control Board have also stepped up monitoring of precursor chemicals, listing more of them for international control as new analogs emerge. These multilateral efforts indicate a recognition the fentanyl problem is global and requires global solutions. Any one country's measures can be undermined if others don't cooperate. For example, if China cracks down, traffickers might source from India, which has a large pharmaceutical sector. In fact, Indian companies have already been implicated in supplying fentanyl precursors to Mexico. A coordinated international approach is needed to chase this ever-moving target. The issue also seeps into the broader U. From Beijing's viewpoint, such accusations are not only unfounded, but insulting. Chinese officials argue that they too care about stopping drugs, citing how opioid addiction devastated China in the past. They sometimes counter-accuse that the US is using the fentanyl issue as a political cudgel, perhaps to extract concessions on unrelated issues or to tarnish China's image internationally. The truth may lie somewhere in between propaganda and reality. China likely does not want to be seen as fueling a deadly epidemic, yet it may prioritize other geopolitical interests above U.S. drug concerns. For instance, when U.S.-China relations deteriorated over Taiwan, China readily halted anti-drug talks, suggesting that to Beijing, fentanyl cooperation is a bargaining chip in the larger diplomatic game. On the flip side, fentanyl could become a rare arena of collaboration if both sides see an enlightened self-interest. It's one of the few issues where the United States and Chinese interests should align. Neither wants uncontrolled synthetic drugs proliferating. If managed carefully, joint efforts against fentanyl might build some trust that spills over into other areas. This was hinted at by policy analysts when Biden and Xi reopened talks, a small ray of hope that shared humanitarian concerns like saving lives from addiction could transcend political animosity. However, that hope is tempered by realism. Any cooperation is fragile, and broader disputes can undo progress quickly. The global nature of the supply chain with production, transit and consumption spanning continents challenges existing drug control regimes that were designed for plant-based drugs like cocaine or heroin. Fentanyl is forcing a rethink of international drug policy and greater emphasis on chemical industry regulation and financial crime cooperation. In this sense, fentanyl is not just a drug problem, but a policy problem involving trade, regulation, and international law. Fentanyl's global web remains intact, but not unchallenged. The crisis has galvanized new alliances and strategies, yet it also lays bare rifts between nations. China's double role in this saga, as both drug enforcer and alleged supplier, epitomizes the complexity facing the world. On one hand, Chinese authorities have shown that strong domestic measures can curb illicit fentanyl production when they choose to act, exemplified by the 2019 analogs ban and high-profile busts. On the other hand, supply routes originating from Chinese soil continue to feed the world's deadliest drug market, and it will take sustained effort and transparency from Beijing to clamp down on the shadowy networks operating within or through its borders. The recent thaw in U.S.-China cooperation offers a glimmer of optimism. If the world's two largest powers can find common ground against this common enemy, lives can be saved. Already, a multi-nation coalition is forming to tackle synthetic drugs on all fronts, from shutting down pill press factories to regulating internet sales to improving addiction treatment for those ensnared by fentanyl's grip. Every component is critical: demand reduction in consuming countries, supply reduction in source countries, and the intelligence sharing and trust that bind efforts together. Yet the fight against fentanyl will be a long, adaptive struggle. Traffickers constantly adjust, seeking the weakest link in the chain. If China imposes new controls, they may try new chemicals or shift operations to other jurisdictions. If the U.S. enhances border inspections, smugglers find more creative concealments. It's a cat-and-mouse game played on a global scale. In this environment, no single nation can succeed alone. A failure to cooperate due to politics or pride would only benefit the criminals and cost more lives. Fentanyl has proven to be a formidable foe, a drug small in size but colossal in impact. Its global trafficking network has bound together chemists in China, cartels in Mexico, dealers in American suburbs, and users everywhere in a deadly chain of commerce. Breaking that chain requires an equally global resolve. For now, families and communities on multiple continents continue to grapple with the fentanyl scourge. Every effort to curb this drug, every lab shuttered in Guangdong, every precursor shipment stopped in a Mexican port, every overdose reversed by a medic, is a step toward preventing another tragedy. The fentanyl crisis is a modern plague that respects no borders. Confronting it successfully may yet compel unlikely partners to work side by side, and in that, perhaps, lies a hopeful irony. That out of a dire public health emergency could emerge a sliver of cooperation in an increasingly divided world. The battle against fentanyl is far from over. But with facts, vigilance, and collaboration, the global community strives to stem the tide of this synthetic poison before it claims another generation.